So thanks very much, Mike, for joining us. We're going to talk about better digital relationships with Omnichannel, which, with all due respect, is a terrible title for a session. Someone who's interested in the beauty of the English language as I am. So it's a bit vague, but we can make it specific. And for the last half hour, we've just heard about SMEs. Now, Cineverse is obviously a big international corporation dealing with a lot of bigger companies. So let's talk about some of the issues around that. So in the summer, I helped to write the Future of Messaging Guide for the MEF, which we've done 3 editions of now, which has been sponsored by Cineverse. And I know from talking to you guys that a big thing for you is something called orchestration, which is all to do with coordinating exactly what we've been talking about for the last 2 days. So maybe you could just explain the concept of orchestration and how you apply it to your corporate customers.
Okay. Do I use the mic?
Yes, please.
So that's good. Yeah, so orchestration, it's really, so what we see is Omnichannel is a paradigm shift. So it's not just a shift from the ATP world where you had a pipe and now you have multiple pipes. So it's a real shift towards providing a solution to end users. You know, it's very much the vertical integration. And just to touch on a point which was mentioned earlier, it's like it's not multi-channel, it's omni-channel. So what you need to do is do an integrated customer experience that goes across the series of channels all the way through the journey. And, you know, how do you make that happen? So what we see is orchestration is a key way of making that happen. So, you know, some small areas could be things like chatbots. So you talk about chatbots in terms of solving kind of that interaction with the end users and being able to hand off to live agents. Obviously, that's a key part of a lot of the new channels. But it's all about trying to put together all these different channels. And then also a lot of the back-end and SaaS infrastructure, which our customers have to provide that end-to-end journey. So it's integrating the different channels, it's providing the right information, being able to personalize it. And that, to us, orchestration is that glue that gets all those different channels and elements together at the same time.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to the whole SaaS thing because that's fascinating. But let's make it a bit more real, though. So you've just described what sort of orchestration is, theoretically. But when you're, you know, let's pretend, you know, I'm a corporate company that's not very good at this stuff, and I come to you guys and I want some solutions. What does it actually look like? How long does it take? What do I need to make it happen internally?
Okay. So I mean, we often talk to our customers. It's not about channels, but it's about the use cases. So we have like multinational. There's a multinational who we're working with, and it's all about they have all their different business units, and each one comes with a use case. You talk through with them in terms of the use case. You map out what the existing components which they have in place. So some of them use ServiceNow, some of them use Marketo, some of them use Adobe, and you know, it's all about identifying those solutions, working out the right channel which they want to use. So we have use cases where it's communicating with their employees, and you know they want to use SMS for that as opposed to email, because these guys are on the shop floor. So there's customer care, so where customers want to contact them, you know, and they want to do the whole shift from voice to using messaging. And so, you know, you identify the countries, and it may make sense to use WhatsApp in some places, Line in other countries based on the region. And then you kind of do all of that mapping, and then you put it all together for them. You kind of scope out what that means, you know, what the dependencies are on their side, what we need to do on our side, and then you work towards doing it. And so it depends on, you know, how, you know, what the customer has in place, how quickly they want it to move. But, you know, really you want to be able to move to delivering solutions in weeks as opposed to months. You know, the old world where the consulting world where you do up a big spec and then you would do the implementation phase and so on. You know, it's really important to manage all of this, but you kind of want to move from that old world where it's all defined in months and almost like a year in terms of implementing things to showing that turnaround in the case of weeks. So
what's happening in those weeks, and what sort of internal expertise do your customers need in order to integrate this stuff?
So I mean, that's it. So I mean, it's funny that the most important expertise we almost have to start with is not speaking omnichannel. So,
Yeah.
you know, we've had so many cases where people haven't thought about it beforehand, and they mentioned the word CPaaS to customers, and customers haven't got a clue what that means. So, you know, it's really being able to speak the customer's language as opposed to our language of RCS, RBM, rich business messaging, even going into WhatsApp. You talk about WABers, you know, WhatsApp business accounts. You can't speak about any of that. You have to speak it in the language which they understand, which comes from the marketing world or customer care and so on. Secondly, it's kind of understanding, you know, how to connect into all of their systems. And you have to understand at least a certain amount in terms of what they're trying to do. So, you know, you have to understand about how Salesforce works, the marketing world, you know, what KPIs are important to those guys. And from there, it's very much kind of not only the implementation and plumbing it all together, but it's that rollout process. And kind of what we see is, unfortunately, we're still in a complexity stage in terms of all these different channels. So, you know, if you're going to launch a channel with Line versus WhatsApp versus SMS versus RCS, you know, there's different processes which you have to go through and different terminology, which is kind of similar in different cases, but they're also slightly different. So, you know, we have to talk them through, say, well, okay, in this country, these are all the different steps. This is the information which we need from you. And what we also see now is, in the old world of SMS, you could almost handle everything on behalf of the customer. So also now you have to guide them through steps which they have to do. So they have to interact directly with people like Facebook and WhatsApp and so on, in terms of setting a lot of this up. So it's not just the technology, but it's kind of moving a lot broader. So
you mentioned Marketo and SaaS, you know, and Adobe, and Salesforce, you know, HubSpot. These platforms are so central now to big enterprises and the way they work that they just want to embed their messaging inside these platforms. So obviously that's possible now, and that's something that I know that Cineverse is working on. Can I ask, first of all, what your relationship is like with those companies? Do you have a relationship with them, or are you just sort of plugging in? And second part of that question is, where does that leave your relationship with your enterprise customers? Are you merely just a button on someone else's relationship platform?
I mean, that's a really good question. It kind of goes to, you know, what Cineverse and kind of the MSP, so the messaging service provider's role is in this ecosystem. So, and really, as far as the end customer sees, they don't see Cineverse at all. So if you're using Apple Business Chat, they see it's Apple Business Chat, and they see it's the big customer, you know, and they go backwards and forwards. And really, we're kind of invisible within there. So, you know, to the end user, you know, Cineverse isn't mentioned at all. Also, in terms of all these the connections in the SaaS world. So there's different levels of interaction. So at a really simple level, there's the technical connection. So it just goes in. And actually, a lot of the SaaS guys out there, you know, they've already enabled it to make it really easy for third parties to plug in. So that's very much kind of plug and play with a very minimal relationship needed with like each of these guys. But what we see at Cineverse is the real advantages to being able to partner at a deeper level, and that's something which we work on with a lot of the big companies out there. And actually, you know, that's either done by kind of approaching them, or often it actually happens organically when you're working with a customer, they need a connection, you kind of build it, or you connect in, and then that really kind of builds the relationship up from there. So, but I mean, it's all driven, you know, at the end of the day, you know, what gets chosen, who gets plugged in, it's the customer's choice. You know, the customer's gone out there, and that's what the SaaS world should be providing to customers, the ability to pick and choose which elements they want to use, and it just all automatically plugs in. So.
Okay. So let me ask probably a stupid question, because a lot of people in this room will know the answer to this anyway, but what does that do to your business models? So if you have a relationship where you're in the background, the customer doesn't know that Cineverse is supplying this comms, this CPaaS stuff, they just know that they're in HubSpot and everything's working well. How does that change your business models compared to when you're working directly with somebody and it's more of an ongoing partnership?
So, you know, the business model, I mean, it's the new world is great because it's a lot more brutal. You know, it's really, you know, the business model has to be driven a lot more by the value. It's not just we're delivering X. You know, it's all about the value which you give to customers, and that really ties in with not just talking about the technology, but the use cases and what you're trying to like solve. So, you know, if we're working with a customer in terms of plugging everything together and then helping them manage their customer care better. So, you know, we've been working with customers where we've switched something like 80% of their voice call center calls to chatbots, and you can see, you know, if you shift 80% of that across, so with a particular customer, it delivered $312 million of savings every single year. So you're really kind of focusing on that, and it's that whole orchestration piece to kind of bring it all together, which delivers on that. But, you know, it's that whole making it all plug in. And, you know, it's a world of different pricing models also. You know, in the previous world, you know, it was all SMS, it was transaction-based, you know, it was all like you sent an SMS, we like charged you X. So what we're seeing now is customers really wanting to move perhaps to a model which is kind of more tied in with the business success, and perhaps more in a SaaS world where it's like a seat-based model, and you know, you get all you can eat in terms of messaging and so on. So we're really seeing that shift as well.
We haven't really talked about business models much today, but it's obviously something that gets a lot of debate in this market for the reason you just talked about, that it's not straightforward to go from alerts to conversations in terms of how you price that. Have you had any conversations or any thoughts on kind of value-based business models where you're, you know, calculating the difference you've made to somebody's bottom line and taking a cut of that?
I mean, that's such a key part of what you need to do. You know, it's all based on the value to the customer.
Yeah.
In a commodity world, it's more based around kind of the price and how much you charge compared to the competition. But I mean, really, you know, it's all about trying to understand and kind of drive that like value. And, you know, that is where you're really looking at, and almost, you know, and often it's where you have to discuss that with the customer in terms of the highlighting some of the costs, because a number of the cost savings aren't necessarily obvious. And, you know, one of the interesting challenges often is, you know, the benefits can be spread across different cost centers. You know, if you're speaking to somebody who's just concerned with the cost, they aren't necessarily as concerned about the additional sales, but it's often reaching out to these additional stakeholders within the company to really get that message across.
I wonder how you would make those calculations anyway.
It is, you know, it requires an open conversation and a level of trust. So, you know, you often have, I mean, I've kind of been in the industry for a scary length of time, and, you know, I've lost count of the number of times where you create a model and you've got all these assumptions in here and you've done loads of research, and then you go and meet a customer and then you share the model, and then it also instantly gets turned upside down or changed around. So, I mean, this is where, you know, and this can be one of the hard parts of the conversation. You know, you need to have enough knowledge to be able to start that conversation to get that level of trust. But really, it's partnering with the customer. You know, you can have your models and you can show particularly cases where you've helped other customers, but it's really kind of understanding a lot of their internal drivers. So.
Well, let's talk about the channels for a bit. You know, as you said at the beginning of the conversation, you're often helping your clients with global reach, and you know, what's popular here is going to be very different from what's popular in Taiwan or you know, whatever. So first of all, talk a little bit about the differences you see, and secondly, what about some of the channels that we haven't really talked too much about today, like the social channels, for example, Twitter or Instagram, whatever? How does that all fit into a big corporate play?
So, I mean, it's interesting from, I mean, if you look at it from the segmentation point of view, so geography is like a classic one, and you know, there's a lot of companies have done their kind of famous maps where you see different colours in different parts of the world. So you see like Facebook Messenger in North America, you see WhatsApp all across Europe and Africa and Latin America, and then you see Line more in like Asia and so on, and even things like Viber in the Middle East and like Russia. So that's kind of the classic one. And, you know, to me it's interesting because, you know, you've always had that. You know, if we go back 10, 15 years in the world of like Windows Messenger and Yahoo, you know, you always had that split. And then, that's kind of that's one of the obvious ways to look at it. But I mean, it's very interesting as well when you kind of dive into other ways to try and split it. So if you look at it from the demographic point of view, so, you can see, you have WhatsApp as the most, important one, let's say in the UK, but I know that the younger demographic is using very different channels. So this is where things like Snapchat comes up. Instagram chat is becoming a lot more popular. So Kik also. So,
Right.
there's a lot of these other channels which you wouldn't see looking at it at that level. But, if you're trying to reach a younger audience, this suddenly become a lot more important. And then, what we've also seen is, particularly in the Middle East, you see a lot of expat groups. So you kind of see people who'd be using a channel which is perhaps more predominantly used in, let's say, China or India, and then you get a lot of people within the UAE using it. So you kind of get a lot of it's really having to understand the target markets almost. So you can get a nice course view based on where you are, but then you then also have to dive down those extra levels.
And I suppose what makes it more complicated is, as we heard with the recipe card chat earlier, you can't just say, oh, well, WhatsApp's really popular in Europe and Line is really popular in Japan, so let's just do exactly what we do in Europe, but move, just do it through a different channel, because they all have different rules. And so I suppose that adds a layer of complexity. Yeah,
I mean, that's it. You really have to look at the different rules. It goes through from the setup. So different companies have different needs in terms of registration and proving who you are and setting up all these phone numbers, and then you see the different rules in terms of what use cases are supported. So people like Viber, there's a whole range. If you look at WhatsApp, it's very much at the moment just conversational and transactional. And then you move all the way across to Apple Business Chat, where it's all driven around the customer in initiating it, so it's customer driven. And they've obviously got a lot more stricter rules around what the experience needs to be. So if you're using Apple Business Chat, you can have a chatbot, but you always need to be able to escalate to a live human, which has really kind of driven how they've approached it. And it's understanding, that's where you need to almost go to the use case point of view. So the use case defines not just perhaps what's the most appropriate one for the end customer, but actually what you can and can't do with all these different channels.
It'd be interesting to see how companies game this system, because I believe we're already seeing some of it with, I don't remember the exact rules, but something like WhatsApp said that you could only, you could do promotional stuff, but only if the customer had contacted you first.
Yeah.
And so then they were contacting the customer on SMS, and telling the customer to contact them on WhatsApp. So they were still contacting the customer first, but it's just on a different channel in a sneaky way.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. And it's one of the interesting things with the system, where people, every time you put rules out, people will try and work around it, or try and work out the best way to use it to their advantage, in terms of like reach, customer experience, cost, and so on. And also you see, one of the interesting rules on WhatsApp. So, it costs you as an enterprise a different amount if you reach out to the customer as opposed to the customer contacting you first.
Right.
So, those particular cost models means that people are really looking at approaching it. And Apple are interesting, where they very much the customer has to contact you first, and then but the customer can also kind of close it off within the channel, which is good for Apple. But I mean, perhaps that potentially breaks this whole omni-channel journey. Yeah,
well, let's see if it happens with Apple, that people start trying to game that now that they've, as David was saying earlier, slightly changed the rules. On a completely random topic, the best example of gaming I ever heard was recently. I heard that now that algorithms are scanning CVs, what I heard was that algorithms scan CVs for job applications, and they just review them for sort of top-level stuff before the best ones get passed on to humans. And apparently what these clever guys were doing and girls were typing in all the phrases and all of the qualifications that you might need in white ink, in white type on white documents, so that the humans couldn't see them, but the algorithms would pick them up.
Wow.
That was
amazing.
pretty clever, wasn't it? So look, if there are any questions in the audience, let's stick your hands up. We've got a mic coming to you. While we're doing that, maybe I'll just ask a couple more, because I think we've maybe got 2 or 3 more minutes. There's a question on the line, and I've got this iPad in front of me, although I can't see it. So let's see what this question is. Okay. So we know that 95% of listed businesses today are not using business messaging at all, not even SMS. So how do you go about introducing the concept to them that there are so many channels without scaring them so much that they just run for the hills with choice?
Wow. It's a great question. And it just goes to show, there's this big untapped market out there. I mean, admittedly, at Cineverse, what we normally do is we tend to partner with lots of the big multinationals. So that's really been our core focus. In terms of not scaring a lot of these smaller guys out there. So, I mean, it's providing a simpler... I see 2 sides to it. Obviously, you need to tailor your message depending on the segment which you're going after. And that is... And if you're going after let's say, a different segment of the market, which is the like SMEs, you have to tackle it in, you have to combine 3 or 4 different ways to tackle it. So you have to have a simpler story. The pricing model needs to be different. So we talked about business models a bit there. You have to have a completely different pricing model for these guys. And it's really kind of taking them through the journey. But then, what we've found is, often it's better to partner to reach all of these guys. So you have a lot of guys out there in the ecosystem who already target that, a lot of the like SME markets. You mentioned HubSpot earlier. So, I know from experience, a lot of SMEs use HubSpot because it's great, because it's relatively cheap to get started with, the learning curve isn't too bad. So, it's often what we see then is, approaching these guys, it's best to partner to get to them, because then you can leverage the experience and the expertise all these companies out there have in terms of how to tailor the proposition to this part of the market.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to see how that SME market adapts, because it's been a topic of this show that keep coming back to that 95/97% figure of SMEs who aren't doing any of this stuff. Obviously, you're making big progress with the bigger organisations, but there's plenty of work to be done there as well.
Yeah.
I think we have one question at the back from Andy, and we'll take that, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. So just a quick question. I work for a marketing cloud, Cheetah Digital, and many of the enterprises we work with have a huge intrigue towards using conversational channels. But so many of them have concern around budget, and they have a finite budget, which if you have a transactional cost model, very easy to say, we're going to send 1 million messages. It's within our realm of control as to where they go in the budget that comes off the back of it. With some of the new conversational channels, they're P2A led, where they lose some of that control, and the cost models change per channel. So my question is, how can aggregators play a role to simplify that, to make it more consumable for resellers and enterprises, whilst also not exposing themselves to cost?
Okay, so sorry, so so your question is about there's a lot of the smaller companies, they're very concerned about their cost. So, and then it's about not just the simplification, but allowing them to control the cost at the same time.
Yeah, I've been muted.
Sorry, it's a bit quiet.
I'm back again. So not necessarily even small companies. So we work with companies like Hilton and Walgreens and HSBC, and it's a common theme that they will say, here is our known budget that we use for certain channel campaigns, but that becomes very much unknown due to the different models being used in some of these emerging channels. So just working out how aggregators can play a role to make it more consumable for them and predictable in terms of their cost base.
Okay, so it's increasing the predictability from the cost base. So, I mean, it's becoming interesting more. So, I mean, one of the challenges in terms of cost has been, where do you send destinations to, a lot of the underlying costs. So, what we see is Well, the way we approach it is, you really need to partner with them in terms of, if you're doing a campaign, so some guys out there, they want to say they have a certain budget. So you can load a budget in there, you can provide controls to them in terms of, when they hit that budget, you stop, or you can do predicted costs for campaigns. So what we see is if a company's using us more from a campaign point of view, if they can actually craft the campaign and they have the tools to work out what the cost would be. Obviously a lot of the costs are transactional. So, you provide the tools up front as part of designing the campaign to predict what the cost is. And that's something which we're doing more and more, particularly with customers. And that's where, we're trying in a lot of the different channels also. You have different cost bases for these different channels. Some of them have different setup costs, monthly costs, and so on. And actually, something which I've personally been involved in with some of the large customers who we have is really trying to boil, all these different costs you may have there in terms of like setting stuff up or rental costs for phone numbers and so on, and really converting that into a cost per conversation. So, what I've done is spend a lot of time kind of building models with customers, and you really look through the different traffic mixes and kind of what kind of messages which they're trying to send, and particularly the volumes. And we spend a lot of time working with them to try and work out what the cost per conversation is.
It's it's a good question, because that's we talked about business models going from sending a bulk number of text to having conversations, and predictability is a factor that we didn't really talk about. So thanks for bringing it up, Andy. So anyway, look, I think we're overrunning slightly. So Mike, brilliant conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
So everybody, let's say thank you to Michael. Thank you.